first phase of the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas ended Sunday. Israel introduced a new proposal. Hamas has already rejected this new plan. There is now a growing worry and a realistic possibility of the resumption of fighting between both parties. This battle of the last 15 months has turned Gaza into rubble. It's claimed tens of thousands of Palestinian lives. It has endangered the remaining hostages who are in Hamas custody. Both sides are now taking two different and diametrically opposite routes. They are following opposite diplomatic and military paths. On diplomacy, Hamas has demanded the second phase of the original ceasefire deal, which was due to begin from early March. That phase, the second of the earlier ceasefire deal, would end the war. It would require a full Israeli exit from Gaza, and it would also free all the additional hostages and prisoners. Instead, Israel has proposed a 7-week extension of the current ceasefire. Under this plan, Hamas would have to free half of the remaining hostages who are alive and half of those who have already deceased. The Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, has linked this idea to the efforts by Trump-appointed American envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. For many weeks now, Israel has signaled it did not support moving forward with the second phase of the ceasefire. Both sides had agreed in theory, but they never really set clear-cut terms. Their visions are now clashing sharply. The Israeli Prime Minister repeatedly said that Hamas must dismantle its entire civilian governance and its armed military wing. His coalition partners in his government are also sharing the same view. Hamas has indicated strong willingness to relinquish control of the civilian affairs in Gaza, but it is firmly refusing to dissolve its military wing, which is the Qasem Brigades, which remains the core of its power in the war-torn Gaza Strip. This new proposal seems designed to replace the current ceasefire agreement. It would let Israel recover dozens of hostages and many of the remains of others who have died. This plan avoids a full-fledged commitment from Israel to end the war once and for all. However, it fails to resolve the deep differences over what shape and form a final peace will take between Israel and Hamas. At a government meeting over the weekend, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the plan included a temporary ceasefire. This break, according to the Netanyahu plan, would happen during the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan, which has begun this week, and the Jewish Passover, which is expected later this month. Now, according to this Netanyahu plan, half of the remaining hostages in Gaza would return at the start of the temporary ceasefire. The other half would come back at the end of the ceasefire if Hamas and Israel can eventually agree upon a permanent truce. In January, during the first stage of the 3-part ceasefire deal, Hamas freed about 25 Israeli hostages. It also handed over the bodies of 8 other hostages. In exchange, Hamas got back about 1,500 Palestinians who were held in various Israeli jails. Without any further planned exchange of hostages or prisoners, Israel will find it significantly less reasonable to continue maintaining the ceasefire. There is less that Israel gets out of the ceasefire than Hamas does. But right after the Israeli government's proposal, this new idea floated by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Hamas has dismissed it. They have said it is a firm effort to try and renege on the deal that was agreed upon back in January and to avoid the next phase of talks, the second phase of the ceasefire, which would eventually end in a permanent truce. Hamas finds the idea of releasing half the hostages immediately unacceptable. However, it is said it might consider exchanging a smaller number of hostages or even the remains of those who are dead for several Palestinian prisoners, even without a full commitment to finally ending the conflict. Hostages serve as Hamas's strongest bargaining chip. Every time an Israeli captive or an Israeli hostage is traded for Palestinian prisoners, the overall negotiating power that Hamas has weakens significantly. So, for example, if they have 25 hostages in custody, their negotiating power is that much greater, as opposed to having just 10 or 5 hostages in custody. So this strategy really is a battle of attrition more than anything else, but it may eventually force Israel to make that difficult choice. On the one hand, should it reignite the war because a large number of hostages have already been freed and remove Hamas, or should Israel focus on saving alive the remaining hostages? About 25 captives and the remains of over 30 others are still in Gaza. This is according to reliable top Israeli authorities. Both Israel and Hamas have sent over negotiators over the last few days who have met with mediators from Egypt and Qatar. Remember, the original ceasefire that was agreed upon in mid-January was brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. Even as ongoing diplomatic talks continue, both sides are actively preparing for the possibility of a renewed large-scale conflict. Israel has prepared extensively for a new and intense campaign in Gaza. In fact, multiple top Israeli officials have told various newspapers and television channels that they are ready for the offensive if asked to do so by the executive. They've also said that any new operation would target Hamas figures who misdirect vital humanitarian aid which is meant for civilians. That's one of the reasons why Israel has stopped any further humanitarian aid into Gaza, even though that was one of the underwritten conditions in the January ceasefire deal. They would also destroy buildings and critical infrastructure which is used by Hamas to control the civilian sector in Gaza. Officials have also noted that the Israeli cabinet has not approved a renewal of fighting, a renewal of conflict and the intensity of going after Hamas figureheads, but they believe that only US President Donald Trump can now stop the conflict from reigniting by persuading the Israeli side and by persuading the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, to avoid going back to war. All discussions reveal very deep divisions and very high stakes between both the warring parties, that's Israel and Hamas. Both sides are maintaining a firm position when it comes to the diplomatic route and also military preparations which are continuing side by side. The proposal put forth by Netanyahu, the rejection by Hamas, all of this reflects a continuing struggle over control, security, and ultimately the fate of the remaining hostages. This complex situation leaves very little room for compromise. It also heightens the risk of renewed conflict. Some are saying it could start as early as this week if Netanyahu is able to convince the Israeli cabinet to further continuing the war, and if he also gets a buy-in from the Trump administration. Overall, given these two extremes, given that this temporary proposal has already been rejected by Hamas, the future of Gaza remains perilously uncertain.